You're here. And that means everything to me. Welcome to the Detail Detective, where we follow every thread, no matter how small, until the truth has nowhere left to hide. If this channel is new to you, hit subscribe. A new case drops every week.
It is a Saturday morning in April. The Sierra Nevada mountains are still cold, still quiet. The pines hold the frost from the night before. And 14-year-old Sheila Sharp is walking across a dirt path from cabin 27, where she slept, to cabin 28, where her family lives. The walk takes 11 seconds. She has done it 100 times. She pushes open the door. What she sees next will take investigators 4 decades to even partially explain, and the full truth may never be spoken aloud in a courtroom. Welcome to the Detail Detective. My name is not important. What matters is the evidence. What matters is the detail nobody checked. Today, we are inside cabin 28. Keddie is not the kind of place you visit on purpose. Nestled in the Plumas County wilderness of Northern California, it is a resort in the loosest sense of the word, a cluster of weathered wooden cabins pressed against the tree line, accessible by a single road, populated mostly by people who could not afford to live somewhere else. By 1981, the resort is fading. Paint peels. Pipes rattle. Families move in for a season and sometimes never leave. Sue Sharp moved there with her 5 children after separating from her husband. She is 36 years old. She is kind. She keeps her door unlocked because the people around her are neighbors, and neighbors, in a place this small, this isolated, become something close to family whether you choose them or not. On the night of April 11th, 1981, Sue's cabin is warm and lit. Her son John, 15 years old, is inside with his friend Dana Wingate, 17. Her youngest children are in the back bedroom. It is an ordinary Saturday night at the edge of the wilderness. By morning, 3 people in that cabin will be dead. 1 will be missing. And 4 children will have slept through every single moment of it, separated from the killing floor by nothing more than a thin wall and a closed door. Here is the detail that will anchor everything you are about to hear. The killers entered cabin 28 that night and moved through the living room with extraordinary violence. They bound their victims. They used a hammer. They used a knife. The coroner's report will later describe wounds consistent with prolonged, rage-driven assault, what forensic analysts call overkill, violence that goes far beyond the threshold required to cause death, violence that is personal, that is emotional, that carries the unmistakable signature of someone who knew exactly who they were hurting. They did all of this. And then they walked to the end of the hallway. They stood outside the back bedroom door. And they left. For children, asleep on the other side of that door, were never touched. That is not the behavior of a stranger. That is not random. That is a decision, made in the dark, in the middle of an act of extraordinary brutality, by someone who had a reason to stop. We are going to find that reason. Stay with me. To understand what happened inside cabin 28, you need to understand what Keddie Resort actually was in 1981. It is not a destination. It is an ending point. The resort sits at roughly 3,500 feet elevation in Plumas County, a stretch of Northern California so remote that the nearest hospital is an hour away on a good road in good weather. The cabins are cheap. The rent is low. And the community that forms there is the kind that forms anywhere people are held together not by choice but by circumstance, tight, tangled, and occasionally dangerous. Sue Sharp is not a woman who planned to end up here. She is originally from Connecticut, educated, warm by every account from people who knew her. She separates from her husband Jim Sharp and makes the decision to start over in the mountains with her 5 children, Sheila, 14, John, 15, Tina, 12, Rick, 10, and Greg, just 5 years old. She finds work. She keeps the cabin orderly. She leaves the door unlocked because in a resort this small, everyone knows everyone, and locking your door feels like an accusation. This is the first thing you need to hold on to. The unlocked door is not carelessness. It is trust. And in Cabin 28, trust is the weapon that is used against her. By the evening of April 11th, the cabin is easy and relaxed. John has invited his friend Dana Wingate over, 17 years old, a local kid, easygoing by all accounts, the kind of teenager who drifts between houses in small communities without anyone thinking twice. Sheila, the eldest daughter, heads next door to Cabin 27 for a sleepover with a friend. The younger children, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin Smartt, 12, settle into the back bedroom. Justin Smartt. Remember that name. The Smarts live nearby. Martin Smartt and his wife Marilyn are fixtures in the Keddie social orbit, the kind of neighbors who appear at your door without calling ahead, who borrow things and return them, who sit at your kitchen table long enough that the distinction between guest and resident starts to blur. Martin is in his 30s, physically imposing, with a history that the people around him only partially know. His friend John Bubaid is staying with the Smarts at this time, a man described by acquaintances as volatile, unpredictable, someone with a capacity for sudden and disproportionate anger. On the night of April 11th, both men are unaccounted for during the critical hours. No alibi that holds. No witness that clears them. Sheila Sharp returns to Cabin 28 at approximately 8 in the morning on April 12th. She pushes open the unlocked door. She sees her mother and her brother and Dana Wingate, bound with electrical cord and medical tape, beaten, stabbed, arranged in the living room in the aftermath of what the coroner will later describe as a sustained and ferocious assault. She runs. The first responders who arrive at Cabin 28 that morning face a scene of significant violence. And here is the detail everyone missed. Not the violence itself, but what the violence was allowed to become in the hours that followed. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department in 1981 is not equipped for this. The crime scene is compromised almost immediately. Neighbors walk through. Evidence is handled without protocol. Critical trace material, hair, fiber, fingerprints, is either lost or rendered inadmissible before any serious forensic analysis can begin. The lead investigators will later face sustained criticism for a response that prioritized speed over procedure, assumption over analysis. Within hours of discovery, the integrity of Cabin 28 as an evidence site is functionally destroyed. You cannot overstate what this means. In a case with no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no surviving victims who saw anything, the physical evidence is everything. And in the first 24 hours, that evidence is walked on, touched, moved, and contaminated by the very people whose job it is to protect it. This is what forensic analysts call incomplete investigation bias, when the earliest failures in a case create a deficit so deep that every subsequent effort to find the truth is working uphill against the damage already done. Plumas County will spend the next 4 decades trying to climb that hill. The victims tell you something important, even in death. Victimology, the study of who was targeted and why, is one of the most reliable tools in behavioral analysis. And the victim profile at Cabin 28 raises a question that the initial investigation never adequately answers. Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, an adult woman, a teenage boy, a teenage boy's friend. 3 people with no obvious shared enemy, no criminal connections, no history of violence, no debt, no dispute on record, nothing in their individual profiles that makes them logical targets for a stranger seeking victims at random. And yet the violence directed at them is extreme, sustained, personal. This was not a robbery. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was not a stranger who wandered in from the cold. This was someone who came to that cabin with intention, and the unlocked door did not create the opportunity. It simply removed an obstacle. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, Sue's daughter, is not found with the others. She is simply gone. No body, no trail, no explanation offered by the physical evidence that remains. 4 children in the back bedroom, untouched. 1 child missing from the entire scene. And no one who did this has spent a single day in prison. Not yet. Let us hold here for a moment and take stock of what you know. 3 people are dead inside cabin 28. The crime scene, compromised within hours, has already begun to swallow the evidence whole. A 12-year-old girl is missing from a location where every other child was left completely unharmed. And the killers entered through an unlocked door, in the middle of the night, without waking a single person in the back bedroom. The surface story says this is a tragedy without answers. But the details say something else entirely. If you have not already subscribed to the Detailed Detective, now is the time. Hit the subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because the cases we cover do not end when the official file closes. They end when the last detail has been examined. And in Cabin 28, we are just getting to the details that matter most. Sheila Sharp is 12 years old in the last photograph taken of her. She has her mother's eyes. She is the middle child, old enough to understand what the adults around her are doing, young enough to still trust all of them completely. On the night of April 11th, she is inside Cabin 28. By morning, she is not. And for 3 years, that is all anyone can say with certainty. In 1984, a skull fragment is discovered near Feather River, approximately 40 miles from Keddie Resort, in an area called Camp 18. It is partial. It is weathered. It tells investigators almost nothing at the time. The forensic technology of 1984 cannot extract what the evidence is holding. The fragment is catalogued. The case moves no further. 20 years pass. In 2004, DNA analysis, unavailable to the original investigators, confirms what Sheila Sharp has believed for 2 decades. The fragment belongs to Tina. Her remains were carried 40 miles from the cabin where she was taken. Disposed of. Hidden in terrain that the killers clearly knew well enough to navigate in the dark. Look closer at that statement. 40 miles. In the dark. In the Sierra Nevada. This is not a panic disposal. This is not someone making a desperate decision under pressure. This is someone who knew where they were going, who had, on some level, already considered where a body might not be found. That is premeditation reaching beyond the crime itself. That is a mind that was thinking about concealment before the night was over. Martin Smartt comes into focus slowly, the way suspects in cold cases often do, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of details that individually mean little and collectively mean everything. He is in his 30s at the time of the murders. He is a neighbor. He is a frequent presence in Sue Sharp's social circle. He has access to the cabin. He has no alibi for the critical hours of April 11th into April 12th. And he has a motive thread that investigators in 1981 either do not find or do not follow with sufficient urgency. Here is the thread. Martin Smartt's wife, Marilyn, has a complicated history with Sue Sharp's estranged husband, Jim. The relationships between these adults, the jealousies, the grievances, the specific anger that accumulates in small, isolated communities where everyone knows everyone's business, form a web that the original investigation never fully maps. What is documented is this. At some point after the murders, Martin Smartt writes a note to his therapist. The note reads, and you need to sit with these words, I have paid the price for the love of a woman. That is not the language of an innocent man processing grief. That is a confession wearing the clothes of ambiguity. Investigators and analysts who later examine this note interpret it as Smartt's acknowledgement that the murders were connected to a woman, to Marilyn, to Sue, to the specific emotional knot that had formed between these two households in the months before April 11th. The price he paid was not financial. The price, in this reading, was the act itself and everything that followed. John Boubaid enters the picture as the second man. He is staying with the Smarts at the time of the murders. People who know him describe a man with a volatile temperament, a history of sudden and disproportionate anger, someone capable of escalating a situation past the point where reasonable people would stop. He has no established alibi for the night in question. He is named by investigators as a person of interest in the years following the murders, and the behavioral profile that emerges from witness accounts is consistent with the level of violence documented at the scene.
Bauer dies before he can be formally charged. And this is with a Timlen Comletain Brack, BK in a case already defined by Instituten Filer, the deck of the primary suspect become the final body between the Sharp family and any form of legal activity. The main video are believed to have entered cabin 28 on April 11, 1981 will never sit before a jury. They will never be cross-examined. They will never be forced to explain what happened at the end of that handway, outside the back bedroom door.
The polygraph that Martin Smartt passes in the early days of the investigation deserves specific attention, because it will be used for years as a reason to look elsewhere. Polygraphs measure physiological responses, heart rate, respiration, galvanic skin response, to questions designed to provoke anxiety in someone who is lying. They are not lie detectors. They are anxiety detectors. And what the behavioral science literature has documented extensively is that certain individuals, particularly those with psychopathic traits, or those who have engaged in sufficient rationalization of their actions, can regulate these responses in ways that produce a clean result on a polygraph examination. The polygraph Smartt passes does not clear him. It tells you that on that particular day, in that particular room, Martin Smartt was not physiologically betrayed by his own conscience. That is a very different thing from innocence. In 2016, 35 years after the murders, a toolbox belonging to Martin Smartt is pulled from a pond near his former residence. Inside the toolbox is a hammer. Forensic analysis of the hammer is consistent with the wounds documented in the coroner's report, blunt force trauma injuries that the original autopsy described as delivered with significant force, repeatedly, to multiple victims. The hammer has been underwater for 3.5 decades. It has been sitting in the dark, in the silt, waiting. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department announces that they believe they have identified the individuals responsible for the murders at Cabin 28. Martin Smartt is indicted by a grand jury in April 2016 on 3 counts of first-degree murder. He is 74 years old. He will die in 2022 before the case ever reaches trial. There is one more piece of evidence that the official record does not fully address, and it is the piece that brings us back to the beginning. Back to the closed door at the end of the hallway. Back to the 4 children who were never touched. Justin Smartt is 12 years old on the night of April 11, 1981. He is Martin Smartt's son. And he is asleep in the back bedroom of Cabin 28, on the other side of that door, while his father moves through the living room. The behavioral question this raises is not a small one. 2 men capable of sustained, rage-driven violence against 3 people, one of them a 15-year-old boy, stop at a bedroom door. They do not open it. They do not check what is inside. They walk away. Why? The answer, when you hold it against everything else you now know, is the most human and the most devastating detail in this entire case. There is a concept in criminology called the threshold moment, the precise point in an act of violence where the perpetrator either escalates or stops. It is rarely a rational decision. It is rarely conscious. It is the collision between what a person is capable of doing and what they find, in the critical instant, that they cannot. Martin Smartt stood at that threshold at the end of the hallway in cabin 28. And he did not open the door. The leading theory among investigators and behavioral analysts who have spent years inside this case is not complicated, but it is devastating in its simplicity. Martin Smartt could not kill his own son. And if he opened that door, if he crossed that threshold, he would have had to face what he was in front of the one person whose existence made him something other than a killer. Justin was not just a witness risk. Justin was the reason the door stayed closed. The presence of his child in that room was the single restraint that held inside a night where every other restraint had already failed. But here is what makes this theory truly chilling. Smartt did not spare 4 children out of mercy. He did not stop because he felt remorse. He stopped because his son was there, and that distinction matters enormously when you are trying to understand the psychology of what happened in that cabin. The other children in that room, Sheila, Rick, Greg, and Justin himself, lived not because their lives were valued by the men in that hallway. They lived because one of those men had a single personal boundary left. One line he would not cross. And they happened to be on the right side of it. That is not mercy. That is accident. Sheila Sharp has spent more than 4 decades carrying the weight of that morning. She has spoken publicly about the case in the years since, carefully, deliberately, with the measured language of someone who has learned that grief expressed carelessly gets taken and reshaped by people who were not there. In interviews, she does not perform her loss. She simply states it. She found her family. She has never stopped looking for the full truth. She has watched 2 men, the men her family and investigators believe responsible, die without ever being held to account in a courtroom. What she lives with is not just grief. It is the specific, unresolvable anguish of a case that came within reach of justice, and then watched justice die of old age. The Plumas County grand jury indictment of Martin Smartt in 2016 represents the closest this case has ever come to a legal reckoning. 3 counts of first-degree murder. A formal acknowledgement by the justice system that the evidence, the hammer, the therapist note, the behavioral record, the timeline, pointed at one man with sufficient certainty to put his name on a charging document. And then Martin Smartt died in 2022. The indictment dies with him. No trial. No verdict. No sentencing. No moment in which a jury looks at the evidence and renders the judgment that Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate, and Tina, found in fragments 40 miles away, were owed by the law that failed to protect them in the first place. John Bubaid is already gone. Martin Smartt is gone. The only people who know exactly what was said, what was planned, what happened in the minutes before that unlocked door was pushed open, are dead. Cast your mind back to the very first detail planted at the beginning of this case. The closed door. The 4 children sleeping on the other side. The question of why 2 men, who had just committed acts of extraordinary brutality, simply stopped. You now have the answer. Justin Smartt was behind that door. His father was in the hallway. And whatever Martin Smartt was in those hours, whatever rage or jealousy or cold calculation had brought him to that cabin in the dark, he was still, in some residual and terrible way, a father. The door was the boundary of that. Everything on the other side of it, the living room, the victims, the violence, existed in a psychological space where the normal constraints had already collapsed. But the bedroom door was where his son slept. And that, only that, was where the collapse stopped. 4 children are alive today because of it. There is a modern bridge here that connects cabin 28 to something you already know, something you have felt in your own life, even if you have never been anywhere near a crime scene. The killer in this case was not a stranger. He was not someone who emerged from the darkness of the tree line, someone unknown and unknowable. He was the neighbor, the familiar face, the man whose son slept in your children's bedroom, the man whose wife sat at your kitchen table, the man you let into your home without locking the door, because locking the door would have felt like an insult to someone you trusted. This is the specific danger that true crime cases return to, again and again, across decades and jurisdictions and vastly different circumstances, the danger of the person already inside the circle. The threat that does not look like a threat because it is wearing the face of familiarity. Sue Sharp did not make a mistake by leaving her door unlocked. She made a reasonable judgment based on the information she had, that the people around her were safe, that proximity meant something, that a small community in the mountains was the kind of place where you did not need to be afraid of your neighbors. She was wrong. But the wrongness was not hers. The wrongness belonged entirely to the men who used her trust as the mechanism of her death. Cabin 28 still stands at Keddie Resort. 4 years it stood empty, a structure that locals avoided and visitors photographed from a distance, a place that had absorbed something that no amount of time had fully neutralized. In 2004, the cabin was demolished. The physical structure is gone. But the case is not gone. It has never been closed. It remains an open homicide investigation in Plumas County, technically, formally, legally unresolved. Because an indictment is not a conviction. And a conviction is not justice if it never happens. Sheila Sharp was 12 years old. She was carried 40 miles into the mountains and left in pieces near a river. She waited 20 years for science to catch up to what had been done to her. She got a name attached to her remains. She did not get a trial. She deserved one. They all did. So what do we take from cabin 28? There are 3 things. And I want you to hold all 3 of them at the same time, because it is only when you hold them together that the full weight of this case becomes clear. The first is factual. The investigation into the Keddie cabin murders was compromised within hours of discovery, and that compromise was not an accident of circumstance. It was the result of an under-resourced, under-trained response to a crime that exceeded the capacity of the system asked to solve it. The crime scene was contaminated. Evidence was handled without protocol. A polygraph was given evidentiary weight it has never deserved in any court of law. And the result of those early failures was a 40-year deficit, a hole in the case so deep that by the time the right tools existed to find the truth, the men who held it were already dying of old age. The lesson is not that rural law enforcement is incompetent. The lesson is that the first 24 hours of a homicide investigation are irreversible. What is lost in those hours is lost permanently. And in cabin 28, almost everything was lost in those hours. The second takeaway is analytical. The behavioral evidence at the scene reveals something that a surface reading of the case misses entirely. This was not a single psychological event. It was two psychological events happening simultaneously, rage and restraint, existing in the same person, in the same hallway, within minutes of each other. The overkill pattern in the living room speaks to a man who had lost the capacity for regulation, whose violence had become untethered from any internal governor. And the closed bedroom door speaks to a man who had not lost everything, who retained, in the most narrow and specific sense, one remaining constraint. Forensic psychology tells us that this kind of compartmentalization is not rare in offenders with organized-disorganized profiles. What is rare is having the physical evidence to see it this clearly. The hammer in the living room and the untouched door at the end of the hallway are not contradictions. They are a portrait. The third takeaway is the one that stays with you. The most terrifying thing about Cabin 28 is not the violence. Violence, in the architecture of true crime, is almost expected. It is the fact of the case, the event around which everything else is organized. What is terrifying, genuinely, durably terrifying, is the ordinariness of everything that preceded it. A Saturday night. An unlocked door. A neighbor whose son was asleep in the back bedroom. A woman who had no reason to be afraid of the people already inside her living room. Sue Sharp did not die because she was careless. She died because she was human, because she extended the basic social trust that makes ordinary life possible to people who had already decided to betray it. And that truth does not belong only to Cabin 28. It belongs to every case in which the perpetrator was known, trusted, welcomed. It belongs to the gap between who people appear to be and what they are capable of becoming in the dark. You cannot protect yourself from that gap by being more suspicious. You cannot lock it out. It exists in the nature of human relationships, the irreducible risk of letting anyone close enough to matter. That is what Cabin 28 leaves you with. Not a lesson you can act on. A truth you simply have to carry. Before we close, I want to ask you something specific. Justin Smartt was in that back bedroom. His father was in that hallway. And 4 children walked out of Cabin 28 alive. Do you believe it was Justin's presence that stopped Martin Smartt from opening that door? Or do you think there was another reason those children were never touched? I want to hear your theory. Leave it in the comments below. The best cases are not solved by one person examining the evidence alone. They are solved by many people, looking carefully, from many different angles. That is what we do here. Sheila Sharp is still alive. She has never stopped asking for the truth. She has watched the legal case against the man believed responsible collapse not under the weight of innocence, but under the weight of time. She does not have justice. She has only the knowledge of what happened, and the knowledge of what was taken. Tina Sharp was 12 years old. She deserved to be 40. She deserved to be 60. She deserved every ordinary year that was decided against her in a cabin in the Sierra Nevada on a night in April, 43 years ago. Remember her name. Subscribe to the Detail Detective. The next case is already waiting. And it starts, as they all do, with a detail nobody checked.